Britain's forgotten panic. It began not with a dramatic crash, nor with headlines announcing catastrophe, but with a tremor so subtle that most of the kingdom never noticed. A delay here. A rumor there. Whispers of uncertainty drifting through London's financial circles like smoke curling under a door. For years, Britain had believed its banking system was unshakable, a fortress of prudence anchored by tradition. But beneath that reassuring image, pressure had been quietly building. To understand the panic that nearly rewired Britain's financial destiny, we must return to an era when the empire stood at its peak yet carried hidden vulnerabilities. London was the world's clearinghouse. Credit flowed in and out of the city with unmatched speed. Banks handled fortunes spanning continents, confident in their methods and protected by the prestige of the British name. But confidence can breed blindness, and blindness can hide fault lines until it is too late. The kingdom trusted its systems so deeply that few imagined how quickly it could slip. The story begins with a bank that appeared as stable as stone. Its columns were imposing, its clientele among the empire's elite. It managed the wealth of merchants expanding into Africa, Asia, and the Americas, wealth that depended on distant markets, unpredictable shipments, and colonial enterprises that promised endless returns. Inside the bank's halls, ledgers reflected optimism. Profits soared. Loans multiplied. And London, convinced of its superiority, rarely questioned the risks accumulating beneath the numbers. Yet cracks quietly emerged. A handful of analysts noticed delays in payments from overseas ventures, delays dismissed as temporary. Insurance claims from maritime losses grew more frequent. Commodity prices shifted with alarming volatility. But none of these signs stirred alarm at the top. Britain believed its institutions were too seasoned, too conservative, too well governed to fall into the trap seen elsewhere in Europe. Behind closed doors, however, some officials urged caution. They warned that the empire's reach had outpaced its ability to manage risk, that too many banks held exposures tied to markets no one truly controlled. But their warnings faded under the hum of prosperity. No one wanted to imagine that the financial heart of the world could falter. Still, in the quiet corners of the city, tension simmered. Traders hesitated before accepting certain drafts. Bankers whispered about unusual withdrawals from accounts linked to colonial ventures. And on the periphery of empire, early failures began to surface, failures that would soon circle back to London's doorstep. For now, the panic remained invisible to the public. But those closest to the ledgers sensed what was coming. A storm was forming beyond the empire's horizon, and Britain's confidence would soon be tested in ways it had not faced for generations. The tremors deepened as overseas reports reached London, each carrying hints of trouble wrapped in diplomatic language. A mining venture in southern Africa announced unexpected losses. A shipping company reported delays and insurance disputes. A colonial railway project, once touted as a symbol of unstoppable expansion, revealed cost overruns that stretched credibility. None of these events alone threatened the empire's financial core, but together they signaled a pattern that London's bankers could no longer ignore. Inside the great institutions of the city, meetings grew longer and more urgent. Analysts reviewed ledgers that no longer aligned with their earlier forecasts. Payments expected months ago had not arrived. Loans once considered rock-solid now appeared exposed. The banks had trusted enterprises thousands of miles away, betting on stability in regions shaped by conflict, weather, and unpredictable markets. Now the cracks in those assumptions widened. Still, public confidence held firm. Newspapers continued to praise the empire's financial machinery. Politicians assured the public that Britain's global reach guaranteed strength, not vulnerability. Yet inside private offices where the empire's wealth flowed, doubts began eroding that certainty. Some bankers quietly reduced their exposure to colonial ventures. Others tightened lending standards without announcing it. A quiet recalibration had begun. But not everyone agreed on the cause or the cure. Traditionalists insisted the disturbances were temporary, the natural ebb and flow of global commerce. They argued that Britain's network of banks was too diversified to suffer real damage. Younger financial minds, however, sensed a structural weakness brewing beneath decades of unquestioned growth. They warned that the empire's financial system had become dependent on perpetual expansion, and any disruption, no matter how small, could send shockwaves through the city. Evidence mounted. A renowned trading house with operations in the Caribbean reported liquidity issues. Letters of credit tied to its ventures began to circulate with hesitation. Merchants demanded more information. Insurers raised premiums. Everyone recognized the signs, yet few were willing to state aloud what they feared. A single major failure could test the kingdom's stability in ways not seen in generations. By now, whispers had reached the Bank of England. Senior officials examined data that painted an increasingly troubling portrait. British banks, though outwardly cautious, had accumulated exposure to enterprises whose prosperity depended on fragile chains of supply and uncertain colonial policies. The empire's reach had become entangled with its financial security. As the tension rose, small events turned ominous. A delay in shipments caused temporary shortages. A prominent merchant abruptly liquidated assets. Withdrawal requests increased, not dramatically, but steadily, just enough for those watching closely to worry about what might come next. London's financial world had always thrived on confidence, quiet, disciplined, unshakable. But now, for the first time in years, that confidence wavered. Behind closed doors, leaders recognized that the margin between stability and crisis had grown thinner than anyone had admitted. And the storm gathering from across the empire was moving faster than they could prepare for. The moment of truth crept into London disguised as routine correspondence. A sealed packet from a colonial office arrived late one evening, carrying numbers that seemed almost impossible. A major enterprise, one whose ventures span mines, railways, and shipping routes, had collapsed under the weight of debts far larger than previously disclosed. Payments expected for months would not arrive at all. Contracts backed by the company's assurances were suddenly worthless. The empire's golden promise had fractured. Inside the halls of the affected banks, urgency replaced caution. Executives pored over figures that revealed a network of exposure far deeper than anyone had acknowledged. The failing enterprise had been the unseen glue holding together a constellation of ventures. Its collapse now sent shockwaves through loans, guarantees, and letters of credit woven into dozens of ledgers. Wealth that appeared solid only days before now trembled on the brink of vanishing. The news spread through the city at dawn, not through official channels but through hurried whispers between clerks, brokers, and messengers. Traders arrived to find markets already shifting. Prices dropped with unnerving speed. Merchants who had once taken pride in their predictable routines now paced the exchange floors with clenched jaws and unsettled eyes. Confidence, the invisible scaffold of British finance, began to fray. Rumors intensified the fear. Some claimed other colonial ventures faced similar undisclosed losses. Others suggested that rival European lenders were withdrawing credit lines in anticipation of wider collapse. None of these stories were fully confirmed, yet each carried enough truth to deepen the anxiety spreading through London. Investors demanded metal instead of paper. Depositors withdrew funds from accounts tied to overseas enterprises. The city's normally composed atmosphere now pulsed with unease. Within the Bank of England, an emergency council convened. Senior officials debated solutions with the strained calm of men trying to stop a breach in a dam. Some argued for immediate intervention, flood the markets with liquidity, reassure the banks, prevent panic from taking root. Others insisted that troubled institutions must face the consequences of their decisions, fearing that heavy-handed support would set a dangerous precedent. The arguments mirrored a deeper conflict, whether the empire's financial hub should continue trusting its global reach, or retreat to protect the core. Meanwhile, the failing enterprise's collapse exposed an uncomfortable truth. Banks had grown dependent on distant profits they scarcely understood. Their ledgers reflected vast exposure to regions where control was more illusion than reality. As losses became public, newspapers seized the story, amplifying uncertainty. For the first time, ordinary citizens questioned whether the empire's financial institutions were as stable as they claimed. Crowds gathered outside bank branches, not in a full run, but in a tense, apprehensive trickle. Each withdrawal chipped away at reserves. Each rumor accelerated doubt. Markets seesawed as traders reacted to every scrap of information, real or imagined. The panic Britain had once believed impossible now loomed within reach. By nightfall, London found itself facing a precarious balance. If confidence slipped further, the entire financial structure could tilt into free fall. And as the city's lights flickered across the Thames, one realization settled heavily in private chambers and public squares alike: the empire's financial supremacy had never been guaranteed. It depended on trust that now trembled with every passing hour. The crisis reached its breaking point on a morning when London awoke to a stillness that felt unnatural. The streets around the city filled with uneasy murmurs, and the usual clatter of commerce sounded muted, cautious. Everyone sensed that the next few hours would determine whether Britain's financial heart would steady itself or stop altogether. In front of several major banks, small crowds gathered, their faces tight with questions no one dared to voice aloud. Inside boardrooms lined with dark wood and heavy portraits, the atmosphere was near electric. Bank directors examined ledgers that had deteriorated beyond their worst fears. Capital reserves were shrinking. Letters of credit were being refused overseas. And exposure to the collapsed enterprise spread across institutions like cracks in old stone. The financial empire that had once seemed untouchable now balanced on a razor's edge. Government ministers rushed to the Bank of England, their expressions sharp with urgency. Reports laid before them revealed a truth impossible to ignore: unless immediate action was taken, multiple banks could fail within days, perhaps hours. Such a collapse would not remain confined to London, it would radiate across the empire, destabilizing trade routes, colonies, and the fragile chain of confidence that held the global system together. A decision had to be made. Intervention meant risking political backlash and admitting that Britain's celebrated financial discipline had faltered. Doing nothing meant gambling with the nation's economic future. After tense hours of debate, the Council reached a conclusion: the Bank of England would extend emergency support, providing liquidity to institutions on the brink and acting as a lender of last resort. It was a move both bold and humbling, a public acknowledgement that even the most respected systems could stumble. The announcement spread quickly. Markets trembled, then steadied. Merchants paused their withdrawals. Banks reopened with reinforced reserves. The panic did not vanish overnight, but the descent slowed. Confidence, bruised, shaken, began to rebuild. London exhaled a breath it hadn't realized it was holding. In the days that followed, investigations revealed how deeply the empire's financial strength had depended on distant ventures managed with too much optimism and too little scrutiny. Reforms were drafted. Oversight tightened. Bankers who had once spoken proudly of limitless opportunity now spoke of caution, resilience, and discipline. The forgotten panic became a lesson retold quietly in the corridors of power, that even the most sophisticated financial systems are vulnerable when trust is taken for granted. And as calm returned to London, a new understanding settled across the empire. Strength is not measured by how loudly a nation boasts, but by how honestly it confronts its own fragility. Britain had survived its moment of reckoning, not unchanged, but wiser, and more aware of the delicate balance that sustains every financial world. So what do you think? Are we repeating the same mistake again?